Our next session is Engineering the 21st Century Entrepreneurship, Diversity, and the Future of Engineering. Diversity and entrepreneurship in the United States are inextricably linked. And according to the 2007 US Survey of Business Owners, nearly 1 out of every 10 working immigrants is a business owner. This is a higher entrepreneurship rate than that of non-immigrants. Minority voices often bring new perspectives and fresh ideas to the larger society, and the world of engineering and innovation is no exception to this maxim. Racial, ethnic, and gender minorities are also making inroads in the US in terms of entrepreneurship and innovation, but more must be done to foster diversity in our field. And as educators, it is our responsibility to play a role in supporting such diversity. It is my pleasure to welcome President Rosenberg of Florida International University to give us his perspective and engage with us in a dialogue to discuss best practices. The first FIU faculty member to ascend to the university's presidency, Mark B. Rosenberg has over 40 years of experience in higher education leadership. He was one of the principal architects of FIU's growth and expansion during the past decade, served as Chancellor of the State University of System of Florida, and is the author, editor, and co-editor of 7 books and numerous scholarly articles on Latin America. Ladies and gentlemen, the 5th President of FIU, Dr. Mark B. Rosenberg.
Thank you, Dean. Good morning, everyone. I have mixed emotions about following Roni Abovitz. But in many ways, he framed some of the larger challenges that I'm gonna attempt to speak to. You have already heard a lot of things about Miami. I won't say much. Obviously, we're very proud of Richard Blanco. I got to brag to our governor a couple of months ago. He was telling us we had to double down on engineering and do more in engineering. And I said, well, we did have an engineer who was instrumental to the inauguration of the last president. And he had a real smile on his face about that. And then I said, of course, he was asked to recite poetry. And it was hard to figure out what an engineer was doing reciting poetry. But Richard is really a very blessed individual that we're proud to have. But you've heard a lot about our community, but I just want to add 2 words. First of all, as being able to welcome you here, but the thing that you need to know about our community can be, without at the risk of trivializing all the great things that are going on here, that you can, if you can get a hold of some Cuban coffee and drink it, you'll be fine for the entire conference. And I talked with one lady here who was commenting that there isn't any, you couldn't get any Cuban coffee here. So hopefully maybe we can correct that before the conference is out. Hope you had a good night at the university last night. We take great pride in our public university. It's less than 50 years old. We have to move at the speed of light as this community grows and expands. We intend to keep up with it. This morning, I want to focus my remarks on some key issues that involve our worlds. And first of all, I do want to let you know that I respect that you as deans have probably the hardest job in the university. And I know that when I became a dean, I remember one of the older, more experienced deans saying to me that, Mark, you need to understand something about your role as dean. On any given issue, 30% of the faculty will privately tell you what you should do. Another 30% of the faculty will be opposed to what you're proposing to do, not because it's a good or a bad idea, but just because they can oppose what you want to do. And the remaining 40% genuinely will not know what to do on the issue that you're addressing. But you can rest assured of one thing. The deans who privately told you what to do and said they would support you will never say so publicly. So you have, in many ways, a very, very lonely and challenging job. And I think that the some of the challenges that you heard this morning make even all the more important what you do. And I'm going to try to speak to those this morning. First, I want to identify some contrasts that I see that we operate in the world in which we operate. I don't like contrasts. I don't like dichotomies. But increasingly, I feel that dichotomies help us to sharpen our focus. So I'm going to paint some for you. Then I want to talk about some of the things that we've done to address some of these challenges. And then finally, identify a few opportunities that I think we should be more aggressive in dealing with. And I know part of the purpose of this gathering is to do just that. So I want to congratulate you in advance. So I want to point to 4 contrasts to start the conversation. The first is a lesson that I learned when I served 3 years as chancellor of the state university system in Tallahassee, responsible for all the 12 universities, the strategies related to the financing of the universities, the strategies related to enrollment management and growth. And Florida is a state that for the better part of the last 2 decades is getting 1,000 new people a day. So we don't really have a lot of margin for error in terms of the kind of educational services that we provide. But the first contrast that bears on the challenges that we confront in this 21st century relate to the fact that we're trained as scientists. We are trained as scientists. We are trained to use logical reasoning, deductive or inductive flows. We're trained to bring data to bear. What I learned in Tallahassee and working knee-deep in the political arena is that something is a lesson that took me a while to figure out. Whereas we're trained that reason drives emotion, what increasingly we're seeing, and what I saw in working in the political sector, was that it was the other way around there, that emotion was driving reason. And the quicker we can figure out, and that you as deans can figure that out, I believe the more successful you will be and your respective units will be. And I'm not suggesting to throw reason out, I'm not suggesting to throw logic out, but what I am suggesting is that the interface that you have in your leadership positions is often an interface where it will not be reason and logic and empirical data that are going to win the day. And in many ways, we have a huge challenge going forward because we know that somehow we're entering into a post-truth era in this country that we have to figure out if we're going to have sustainable models of education and learning. So that's for contrast 1. Contrast 2 is that out there, and again, here's your dichotomy, but out there, incivility, fragmentation, and aimless behavior is the norm. And it's very disturbing, I just tell you. This is not this reminds me more of what I studied. I'm a political scientist, and I still do work on Latin America. This reminds me a lot of earlier political and social conditions in a lot of the countries that I studied. Incivility, fragmentation, aimless behavior. And I want to contrast that part out there with in here. In other words, in our environment. In our environment, my sense is we still have purpose, we still have mission, we still believe in end results. And so I think now more than ever, we have to sharpen our ability to manage what's going on in here in terms of our respective institutions. Thirdly, there's no doubt in this country that there is consensus that over the urgency of improving STEM literacy. There's no doubt about it, that there is a consensus about the urgency. However, what I see is the absence of consensus over how to get there. And I'll illustrate that in a moment. But I think that hurts us. It hurts our ability to be effective. And we've got to come to grips with that. And then finally, there is as well an emerging consensus about the growing recognition of the need for educational uplift. That even though universities and degrees and the high cost are challenged, there's a very clear understanding that a university degree is still an essential, a necessary but not a sufficient condition to being an active participant in social and economic life, particularly in the United States. However, that contrasts, as Roni put it, that contrasts with the reality of the growing disparities among graduates from some colleges and across colleges. It contrasts with the growing income inequality in this country. It contrasts with the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots, even among universities, and then more recently, the data that's coming out about some college graduates actually making a lot more in terms of just measuring income than others. So I'm struck by these contrasts, and I would suggest that we've got to figure them out. We've got to do a lot better. Okay. What I as a president of the university and really a tenured faculty member try to emphasize very clearly is that, and that I would like for our deans, particularly you in your leadership positions, to remember, is that we really do have meaningful work. And that oftentimes we take it for granted, and oftentimes we don't spend enough time on that aspect of who we are and what we do. I think that's going to be more important as we go headlong into the rush of automation, that the human factor is going to be as important. It's not going away, and that was Roni's point. And the challenge that I think that most of us have, which is what he said as we go forward, and which could be the occasion for a whole meeting that you have had or you should have. The issue is not whether we can do high tech. The issue is whether we can do high touch. And that's really, if you will, what he left us with. So I will get back to that in a minute. This is an era of plug and play, the big me, do-it-yourself education, and now, as we've heard, incipient ambient computing. How do we deal with that? I think there've got to be two different commitments that we make going forward. The first is the commitment about the clarity that we need about what we need to do to stay viable. I think there needs to be much more clarity in higher education and much more clarity in your ability to sustain a viable model. And I'm watching very closely this whole conversation about indirect costs that the federal government, is now challenging. And I understand why indirect is so important. We live on indirects, but I wonder whether that doesn't speak to the need for greater clarity about the purpose and mission, that we need to be on. So first is clarity, and the second, I think we have to have much greater what I would call high impact intentionality about what we will do. High impact intentionality. So clarity and intentionality. And while in many respects you as deans are kind of caught in the middle, you're caught between faculty who may have one vision of the good life and let's say an administration or a political regime that has another vision. It strikes me that your responsibility is to help drive that clarity and that intentionality, because in many ways the university is not going to function unless you master your role as educators, researchers, leaders of a very intense high-performance group of individuals. Now, at FIU, which is, as I said, a young public university, we have clarity about the following. We have clarity about the fact that our geography and our demography are our destiny. We know who we are, we know where we are. And whereas in the old days, I came from the University of Pittsburgh, whereas in the old days, we used to curse the darkness of our youth, now we believe that our youth is our strategic competitive advantage. And that the demographics that we have, such as they are demographics that ultimately can be important drivers for 21st century success and role models. So we see ourselves as being obligated to take responsibility for and be a solution center for our community. We're not above our community. And as a public institution, we believe we have to be deeply embedded in our community and demonstrate that every day. And obviously in that mix, there's no more embedded group, if you think about it, than engineers. We also obsess on student success, number one, and on impact. Student success is critical because if we continue to believe that graduation rates are not our responsibility, if we continue to believe that the pipeline of students that we're getting is not our responsibility in some way, if we continue to believe that our community is independent of who we are and what we do, then I promise you, you will find bigger and bigger challenges of sustaining the model that we have in this era of do-it-yourself education and in this era of what promises to be even more hyper accountability. Because what Roni described, the positive side and all the good things, but let me tell you something, if you have that ubiquitous measurement and response capability, who do you think will be the first who are going to be ubiquitously measured and evaluated? It will be us, particularly those of us who are using public funds for our, if you will, conditionality. We also, so we have clarity about who we are, where we are, and what we ought to be doing. And second of all, we also have high impact intentionality about our performance. And when I talk about performance, I'm talking about every aspect of what we do, which we are not used to measuring and holding ourselves accountable for. How do I know that? Because, we said, give us the money, and we will spend it. And most public universities are very budget-centric and not finance-centric, whereas we are moving now into an era of finance-centric budget management, which means we're going to have much greater accountability for everything we do. We have a number of significant diversity initiatives that we're very proud of. A university like ours, in our mix, today we're 70% Hispanic. Half of the students are Cuban American in origin, the other half are from the rest of Latin America. Yesterday I was in a T-Mobile store trying to figure out a little glitch that I was experiencing, and at a certain point the three assistants in the store all disappeared. They all disappeared. They went to the back of the store. They went behind the house. Then they came out and they said, aren't you Mark Rosenberg? And I said, yes, I am. And they said, well, we're all three of us are FIU students. One was Colombian origin, the other was Venezuelan origin, the third was Cuban American. And there they are, at 2021, 22, the masters of that particular universe. So we understand that diversity, and we try to work very, very closely with it. We're in the continental U.S. the number one institution in the graduation of Hispanics in engineering and more generally in the STEM area. We're number 9 in the graduation of African Americans and students, which we're very proud. About 7 years ago, our extended team made a very specific decision to get more deeply embedded in STEM education. We decided to be more aggressive and fervid about understanding it and how to improve it. We, like most institutions, had about a 30% pass rate in intro math courses and in the engineering area. And we decided that, truthfully, we could do a lot better. That started with me, and there's a, I guess a parable here, where I had the opportunity to participate in a National Academy of Science assessment, a 2-year study on barriers and opportunities for 2- and 4-year STEM degrees. I was the only one of the few social scientists, political scientists on the panel, and it clearly opened my eyes to a lot of the issues that people who have my responsibility should be more attentive to. We pivoted that 2-year assessment. There's a book out now on it around 2 questions. Why do many students who enter higher education with an interest in pursuing science, technology, engineering, and math lose that interest before degree completion? There's a huge attrition. And we somehow seem to accept that huge attrition as inevitable. And second of all, how can the quality of the undergraduate STEM students be improved? We had 6 conclusions and 9 recommendations, some of which I'm going to walk through. And subsequent to that, because no good deed goes unpunished, today I am chairing a 2-year study of the National Academies on how to measure STEM success, STEM education success. And what we've found, we haven't released the results yet, but in general, something that you all know, we do not have appropriate measurement capabilities at this point to understand how well we're doing, to understand what we could do more of, and to understand what we could do less of. In spite of the urgency, we still really don't have a good way to measure how we are doing. And so that's something you're going to probably be hearing more about. But what's key here, I believe, is making sure you operate in a culture that promotes, at a university level, a welcoming environment for the STEM fields. And that's something we work hard on. One of the very first things that I did when I became president was make a commitment to the Miami-Dade County Public Schools to start aggressive dual enrollment in STEM in the public schools. Why? Because in what I could see is that we were unhappy with the quality of the students who were arriving in terms of STEM preparation. But all we were was willing to talk about it. We weren't willing to do anything about it. And so we started a partnership with the Miami-Dade County Public Schools. By the way, we're lucky in that we have a unified public school system. It's a county-wide school system, 340,000 students, $7 billion budget, 30,000 teachers. And 35% of the teachers are our graduates. So we had some responsibility in the lack of effectiveness, of teaching at that level to ensure that we could get, if you will, qualified students who could grace our institution. But let me tell you what we found. First of all, very few STEM qualified teachers in the public school system. That's a huge issue. Second of all, to do dual enrollment, we have to have SACS certified teaching laboratories in those schools, and very few of the classes, if we were going to teach in the 46 high schools, university level STEM introductory course, very few of the classrooms had laboratories that could pass SACS accreditation standards. It's possible that as we go into this ambient computing, we're going to transcend that need, but some of you are going to have to be pioneers in that if we're really going to find a way to diffuse high quality STEM instruction into the public high schools. We also started I'll never forget when I was provost, our dean coming to me of engineering and not Dr. Young, but a predecessor, and he said to me, we want to invite you to this engineering gala we're going to have. Now, if you know anything about Miami, you know that every weekend there's a black tie gala. And, every organization raises money. If you invite me to your event, I will, pay, and then I'm going to invite you to my event, and you pay, and that's how, we recycle our money, and we think we've raised money that way. But, so I'm thinking, oh my gosh, another black tie gala. I said, okay, tell me about it. He says, yeah, we're gonna bring 1,000 high school students onto campus for a whole day of immersion in the college. And we're gonna feed them pizza and we're gonna have a good time. Now that's my kind of gala, ladies and gentlemen. And we started that. Now we have about 1,500 students come onto campus. But we recognized that that wasn't enough. So probably like many of you, we started an Engineers on Wheels program. And one of the things that I'm really happy about the Engineers on Wheels program going into the community, look, of the 46 high schools that we have, probably 30 to 35 of those high schools are in low-income areas in Miami. And if we don't get there, those students are not really going to have any serious conversation with well-intended instructors about their potential to be engineers, to be scientists, to be mathematicians. So I'm really, really proud of that Engineers on Wheels exercise. We're also working hard on developing and implementing strategies, like most of you, to increase the representation of women and underrepresented minorities. We still find very significant gaps there. Dr. Young has provided incredible positive leadership for us in that domain. That's a harder chasm to jump, in part because of a cultural predispositions that reinforce stereotypes that make it harder for role modeling and to occur. But we're trying to break that. We're also very much focused on developing a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship. You heard in the introduction that immigrants are increasingly involved in entrepreneurship. Look, the truth is, our curricula are largely 20th century curricula. They are oriented at training our students to take good jobs, not to create good jobs. That's, in my mind, a huge bottleneck that we have. And further, the curricula understand that that most students enter from a level playing field, and increasingly in this country, that's not the case. And we have to do a lot more within our institutional settings to level that playing field. But entrepreneurship is going to drive our 21st century economy in this country. And we have been very tardy at getting to the point where we could be comfortable in infusing entrepreneurship into specific courses on one hand, or finding or having places where our students could come to receive support in their entrepreneurial activities. So we now have 3 incubators that I'm very proud of, one of which has just finished its first cohort. Of the 14 companies, 5 are actually now having conversations with venture capitalists. But look, Miami is the number 2 country in the Kaufman, and number 2 city in the Kaufman Index in the United States. It's only logical that we would be doing this, but truthfully, it took us a lot longer to get there because we did not have enough clarity and intentionality about that. The other night, we did have one of our galas, and we were very lucky to make an announcement. One of our graduates from our College of Engineering in the School of Construction announced a $10 million gift for our School of Construction. Now we're going to call it a School of Construction Infrastructure and Sustainability. This is the first graduate that we've had who has made such a substantial gift. We believe that that it's a function of his understanding of his obligation, on one hand, to help give back, but on the other, the success that the School of Construction has had in not just producing people like Chad, but also that company recognizes that about a quarter of their management are FIU graduates. I would submit to you that each of you have that, you are that backbone for a lot of this country's success. And we have to do better at convincing our graduates to give back. Finally, I want to mention something that's been on my mind for a while, and we may have a chance to do something about it. I know that many of our colleges of engineering, our engineering programs, are very good at fostering a mindset among the students that they need to take away specific competencies during their time in their education. Competencies and certifications that come about that are offered privately. My instinct about that is that we're going to have to get a lot better at that in not only colleges of engineering, but throughout the university, that we're going to have to do a lot better at double and triple competencies beyond simply the traditional majors that our students take. And that if we don't do that, we will lose out. Now, FIU has an opportunity there to move that needle working with you. Just a couple of months ago, the President of the United States nominated one of our deans, in fact, our law school dean, to be the new Secretary of Labor. And while he's not yet he did pass the first step, actually the second step. He goes to the floor in the end of April. We've started to look at what exactly does a Secretary of Labor do. And we found that the Secretary of Labor is a key player in workforce preparation and has billions of dollars of training and retraining money. I'd be curious to know how many of you, as engineering deans, get workforce funding, any workforce funding. Okay, well, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, a handful. But I believe that if we're going to be viable going forward, that we're going to have to do a lot better at preparing our students, not just in engineering, but with specific competencies that in the old days we would not think were relevant to baccalaureate education. And we're going to start a conversation about that at the national level to see how viable that is. Because if some of the other funding dries up, we cannot be tone deaf about where the country's going and what the political leadership of the country thinks it needs in terms of sustaining the competitiveness of our economy. So if any of you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them. Finally, let me just offer some quick fire random observations. I think we got to do a better job at building the pipeline, taking responsibility for improving the quality of engineering education in our local K through 12 environment. If you're not happy with the talent that you're getting, maybe you can do more about that and take responsibility. Second of all, improve the first year. We have to improve the first year education engineering experience. We're losing too many young people who thought they wanted to be engineers. We have to be a lot more thoughtful about that than we've been. Third, something that I increasingly believe in, supporting discipline-based education research. How many of your units actually carry out research about your teaching effectiveness and what works and what doesn't work? We're doing that increasingly in the non-engineering science areas. And it's something that, that people didn't want to get their hands dirty with, but as we go into ambient computing, as we go into what I call intrusive cognitive measures of learning, which we're close now, then I promise you the questions will be asked, why aren't you being more effective in your ability to get students in and get students out? And a lot of that will come through discipline-based education research. Then we got to do better at rewarding faculty who take responsibility for student success in engineering. I understand that the premium now is generally on research and on innovation, but we can't forget our base here. We got to remember that the base ultimately is what feeds and nurtures our ability to do what we do. Obviously, realigning faculty into multidisciplinary problem-oriented pods. In 15 years, anywhere from 25 to 30% of our water in this community will be compromised with saltwater intrusion. Now, if we don't pay attention to that and get on that, who will? And I would submit to you that probably in your respective communities, there are significant environmental challenges that you, with the blessings of all the talent you have, could step into the breach and deal with more intentionally. And they would have to be multidisciplinary groups. Because as Roni pointed out, we haven't done a good job in engineering of preparing our engineers for the policy side, the soft side, the high touch part that's so important. The next point that I want to make is, how do we encourage ourselves to leverage traditional engineering solutions against ecosystem and green capabilities? That we think that probably, building or the built aspect, the structural aspect, the infrastructural aspect of what it is we're trying to address is sufficient, but increasingly we're finding that there are green solutions, that there are ecosystem connections that we could more thoughtfully make. And then finally, let me go back to where Roni was. The reality is that the digital divide is large and getting bigger. Right across from, if you came to the university last night, right across from you, right across from that building you were at, is a community that has a family that has a household income of $28,000. That the school that they have, they use laptops. But when they leave those schools, they got an iPads. When they leave that school, Sweetwater Elementary, they have to leave their iPads there because when they go home, there is no bandwidth. And I would submit to you that we cannot afford to leave behind a whole generation of this millennial generation. And that's something that we have to do a lot better on, thinking through how we close the digital divide, even while we are speeding up capabilities. So, in summary, clarity and intentionality I think are going to be very important for sustainability. Understanding that emotion drives reason these days, unfortunately, and that we have to be more sensitive to that, particularly as leaders. And my instinct is if we can be more focused on those issues, we're going to be a lot more successful in this 21st century. So I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for being here in our community. I want to thank our dean for her leadership and for the planning committee and bringing you to our Miami. Thank you all very much. Good. Thank you. Yeah, whatever. If there's a question. If there's a question, of course, I'll be happy to obfuscate. Yes, that's what presidents do. Oh, Mike. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. Don't worry.
Ken Lucci from Boston University. That was a spectacular talk. I really enjoyed many of your points you made. And I could ask a lot of different questions, but I specifically want to talk about your indication of your major role in doing a national oversight of what's going on in STEM education and how complicated it is from the start because you don't have easily or accessible ways to measure success.
Right.
One thing to think about, which is even harder to decide what the measures of success are, as you go down to the K through 12 systems and try to figure out how to get kids to consider STEM, you'll find that the preponderance of them are talking about science and math.
Yeah.
because the teachers don't know how to even articulate anything about technology and engineering. They're not trained. They're barely trained to educate in science and math, let alone to make that connection. And so I think a secondary but very important challenge is how do you measure how those K through 12 systems are going to try to make those connections to motivate and impassion kids to specifically go into technology and engineering fields and not generally science and math fields, and using us as faculty and deans, but also corporate and industries that need that workforce, which is going to dry up if we're not careful, particularly with U.S. citizens.
Yeah, and I look, it's the most amazing thing that if you look at how, and I've mentioned this to people in Washington, if you look at how the science and engineering bureaucracy is organized, these two studies that I've participated in, I found it extremely frustrating that we were not, it wasn't our mandate to do anything other than the universities, community, than baccalaureate education. That somebody else is doing K through 12. And there's no connection in the science and engineering bureaucracy in this country. When in fact, that the challenge is, by the time we get the students, it's too late. And so if we don't take responsibility and get engaged, it's not going to happen. But the expensive studies that we've carried out are driven by their own respective silos, and so the end result is those of us who actually have experience in and would like to share insights about how do you work with elementary and secondary schools, there's no platform for that. I'm working on that, and we're lucky that we have a unified school system. Let me tell you, most of you come from, if you're urban, you come from urban areas that may have a very fragmented public school system, which means it's going to be hard to have a uniform or unified approach. I'm not too sure if that got at the spirit of your point, but it is something we're working on. By the way, it's probably not likely to happen given the pressures, on decentralization and lowering the scale and scope, reducing the scale and scope of the federal government these days. And so it's a conversation that a number of us want to have to the extent that we can get involved.
I have a comment about our emotion driving reason.
Yeah.
And basically, what we've learned in the last 90 days, our emotion lead a lot of wrong conclusions and sometimes false facts. And as leaders, we're supposed to do what's best for the community and what's best for the country based on reason and logic. If we let our emotion get in the way, this is where we make wrong decisions and actually lead to a lot of wrong facts too.
Well, I'm not necessarily a proponent of that. I'm just trying to shine a light on it in a way that perhaps can give you greater clarity about how you get from A to Z. And I think that the last conversation, the dean from Lehigh, I thought that was, what exactly he said at the beginning about the title of their laboratory. What was it? How many words were in that? I mean, there's and then contrasting it with our wall of wind. I'm a little bit cynical. I think wall of something else. But we have to find better ways to tell the story. I mean, that's really what I'm getting at. And that to be, can I give you one other? I know you're going to, but let me give you one example. A number of us had the opportunity to meet the Secretary of Education 3 weeks ago in Washington in a formal structured meeting. And with the APLU, it set it up. And we, of course, had gone through what each of us were going to say. You don't get that much airtime with the new Secretary of Education. Secretary of Education came in. It was a very good conversation, except that we missed her first point completely. We were tone deaf. Her first point to us was, could we have a conversation about academic freedom? Well, I was going to talk about, research overhead. Somebody was going to talk about DACA. Somebody was going to talk about Pell Grants. You know, you can imagine, you know, what would be on our agenda. And at the end of the meeting, she said, does anybody want to talk about academic freedom? I mean, that was, you know, we just have to do a better job of listening and trying to meet people where they are. It doesn't mean we give up our standards, but it means that this is a different kind of an era. I don't want any dean to sacrifice rigor or precision or empirical validation or the scientific method. I want you to be more effective at that. But there's a big audience out there that has much different views that is very important for us. And we've got to do a better job at understanding that. That's all. That's all. Great. Thank you all very much. Thank you.